To celebrate the recent and excellent Last of Us TV series, I revisited the games, expecting some of the best writing a video game has ever had on offer. However, I was sorely disappointed. It was so bad, I started to wonder if video games are maybe just bad at telling stories. Then, I played Mario Kart and cried. So what's going on? Mario Kart is a better story than The Last of Us. That's the main argument of this video, and I want to explain why I think this is the case. If you want, you can click through to the conclusion using the chapter markers below. Otherwise, I'm going to give you some context to this whole discussion and some important theories of story writing before analysing a few examples from the games themselves. I hope you enjoy it, and if you have anything that you want to say along the way, go ahead and leave a comment below or in the Padlet that I've linked in the description. For clarity, when I'm talking about The Last of Us, I'm talking about the 2013 video game and its 2020 sequel, set in an American dystopia where fungal spores have infected humanity, turning them into plant-like zombies. The player controls Joel, survivor of the plague whose daughter was murdered by the forces attempting to control the outbreak, and Ellie, a young girl born with a natural immunity that may pose a solution for the survival of mankind. The sequel focuses on Ellie's adult life hunting down a soldier called Abby to get revenge for a murder. By comparison, Mario Kart is a game about Mario in a kart. On the 31st of January 2023, Cameron Kunzelman wrote an article for Polygon discussing how The Last of Us became a video game's greatest story ever told. Cameron Kunzelman is one of the leading voices in game studies today, an excellent and prolific theorist and podcaster whose opinion matters. As such, while an article with such a seemingly positive title might seem like good news for the game's developers, Naughty Dog, Kunzelman's article isn't an uncomplicated love letter to the game, but rather an analysis of the claims of the developers. You see, it wasn't Kunzelman who claimed The Last of Us was the best story ever told. It was Craig Mazin, a co-writer and producer on The Last of Us TV show, and famously the mind behind HBO's hit miniseries Chernobyl. This detail is important as The Last of Us is quickly garnering a reputation as an excellent game adaptation, prompting the question why this has worked where so many other game-to-film adaptations, including Super Mario, have failed.
It's a me, Mario.
In his article, Kunzelman suggests the reason for the success might lie in how The Last of Us's developers were willing to lean into cinematic language. There's a suggestion that the cinematic look of the game, made possible by the advances from the PlayStation 2 to PlayStation 3 hardware, allowed for an aesthetic evocative of the best TV and cinema. Specifically, Kunzelman suggests The Last of Us draws on the glut of zombie franchises that have dominated media for the last 20 years.
Don't say that. What? That? What? That? The Z word. Don't say it.
Beyond the zombie genre, The Last of Us is indebted to prestige television series like The Sopranos and Breaking Bad. We might call games like The Last of Us and Naughty Dog's Uncharted series games led by set pieces interspersed with gameplay prestige video game development. The parallels between prestige TV and prestige games is most apparent in the story and character development. Naughty Dog made no secret of how Robert McKee's book Story, a seminal text in Hollywood, is something that lead developer Neil Druckmann is intimately familiar with. Understanding the impact of Robert McKee's writing on prestige game development is vitally important to why I think The Last of Us fails as a video game. While there are too many rules to list here, if we have a look at a few tips from his chapter on The Protagonist, we can get a sense of his style. McKee states that in a movie, the protagonist should be a willful character with conscious desires. These desires may be self-contradictory, but the protagonist has both the capacity and an opportunity to pursue these desires. They should pursue the object of their desires to the human limit acceptable within the genre of your film, although the protagonist doesn't necessarily have to be a human. And ultimately, this pursuit impacts the story as well as the character's personal arc. Most important of all, the movie must build to a single final action, beyond which the audience can't imagine any other. While this style might seem somewhat prescriptive, this is by design, as McKee has a reputation for being somewhat dictatorial, not helped by his portrayal in the film adaptation.
If you can't find that stuff in life, then you, my friend, don't know crap about life.
However, this doesn't change the undeniable impact story writing like this can have. If we think of any satisfying narrative, with things building to a singular climax that feels like the logical climax to your story, this, for me, is the goal of telling good Hollywood stories. This idea has left its mark indelibly on the Last of Us franchise, such as when Ellie hunts down and brutally kills Nora in The Last of Us Part 2. Kunzelman writes about this moment saying, "The thing that we do as Ellie would be less horrible if it was just rote killing, the kind that populates every encounter and narrative beat in the game. Instead, when we find Nora, we enter into a chase sequence and control Ellie as she pursues Nora through the bowels of St. Mary's Hospital, the ground zero for Seattle's experience of the fungal plague that began nearly 30 years before." Kunzelman goes on to note how the director Neil Druckmann reflects on moments like this within the game by saying, "We can make you experience this thirst for revenge, this thirst for retribution, and having you actually commit the acts of finding it, and then showing you the other side to make you regret it, to make you feel dirty for everything you've done in the game, making you realize, I'm actually the villain of this story." The Last of Us represents incredibly powerful storytelling using the basic McKee structure to put players in control of a protagonist that desires revenge and builds towards an unavoidable ending, the alternative to which simply can't be imagined. The ending of the first Last of Us game is similar, as Joel decides to save Ellie from being harvested by the world's scientists, forsaking humanity for the benefit of the few over the many. The desire of Joel has always been to feel the love he once felt for his own daughter, so as an audience we can't possibly imagine any other alternative. Except that, well, of course we can. Of course we can imagine lots of different endings, and I think this is where both games fall completely flat for me, both The Last of Us Part 1 and The Last of Us Part 2. And it's why I can't stand when people hold them up as good examples of video game narratives. It comes down to a failure to accomplish the golden rules of designing narratives for games and virtual worlds. At the core of this is a concept taken from Marie Laure Ryan, that immersion in virtual worlds is dependent on how a writer or designer might construct imaginary worlds governed by their own rules. These rules, which may overlap to various degrees with the laws of the real, must be sufficiently consistent to afford the reader a sense of what is and what isn't possible in the textual world, as well as an appreciation of the imaginative, narrative, and artistic necessity of what ends up being actualized. In other words, when designing a game, a VR experience, or interactive narrative of any kind, it's important to consider how the construction of the world, rather than the construction of the protagonist, is what provides a sense of believability to the actions that our characters can take. Let me talk about Mario Kart for a second to try to make sense of all this. In Mario Kart, we never see anything about the world of the game other than our racers and their respective karts in relation to it. There's never a sense that there's an alternative for the characters other than to race. We might recognize the characters from different games or have a sense of the virtual worlds that they've been drawn from, but in the context of the game, there's no question in our minds as players that this is all about racing. As such, players are free to enjoy the inherent narrative of each race or tournament, simple as it is. Now, you might be thinking, that's not much of a story, just seeing where you place out of a list of 12 competitors. But this, to me, is where things really get interesting. You see, building on Laure Ryan's theories of narrative for virtuality and placing an emphasis on the world to give context to actions, Hartmut Konitz writes about how narratives with interactive media can actually emerge from play. He writes, "Once a user starts to engage with the system, a process is created that is defined by the opportunities the system provides and shaped by the user's actions. The resulting product of an interactive digital narrative, a single walkthrough, represents an instantiated narrative. In other words, there's more to Mario Kart's narratives than we can really write down on a single page. The game is a system that allows for the construction of personal narratives in response to it. The lack of a traditional story structure, character plots, and arcs actually sets the player free to create their own in relation to the game. A narrative that can emerge from the game might be how, say, you got better with playing as a certain character, or maybe how you got better than your older sibling or your partner. They could be dark narratives, like getting worse at the game after an accident, or maybe missing an important deadline because you spent too much time playing the game.
It's like in the great stories, Mr. Frodo. The ones that really mattered.
But these narratives are dependent on the game, the player, and gameplay, rather than being ancillary to it. This approach adheres beautifully to one of the most important textbooks for game design ever written, Designing Virtual Worlds by Richard Bartle. He writes, "Virtual worlds should be as open-ended as possible. Players should be able to try anything. They don't have to succeed." Going back to The Last of Us quickly, I want to hammer the point home by addressing what Druckmann says about how a game can make a player feel, that it can make you realize you're the antagonist of a plot. To be blunt, get over yourself, Neil. You didn't make me the bad guy. Yeah, you didn't make me feel like I'm the antagonist. You simply didn't provide me with an alternative. When I start chasing Nora, I'm left wondering, why can't I stop? I get that Ellie, the character, has got beef with Nora, but I'm not Ellie, and I'm not convinced that she needs to be following this path of action either. You see, we see survivor camps throughout The Last of Us all the time, but we aren't given the option to join them in any meaningful long-term way. The only satisfying gameplay solution to a world this similar to our own would be to let us choose to survive peacefully until we die of old age, like so many of the other non-player characters are doing, or else to become a bloodthirsty murderer in a way that is morally reprehensible but likely a lot more fun. Now that would be an interesting conundrum. To conclude then, in the end, storytelling in video games is about creating immersion through the construction of a robust textual world, not through the development of a protagonist. The more a world is presented to players in which our actions can make sense, the more fulfilling a narrative can be within it. When I'm confronted by the world of The Last of Us, basically just the real world but with plant zombies, but then I'm forced to watch my characters do things I don't agree with, rather than having options to pursue any of the clearly visible alternatives, I find it difficult to accept that the actions my avatar are taking are anything to do with me. By comparison, when a game sets out a world in which my only possible actions are to take part in the central gameplay loop, like how in Mario Kart, Mario is always in that cart, never emerges from the cart, races in the cart, presumably forever.
God, life's relentless.
I can accept that world. I can become invested in it, and I can believe in and love the stories that emerge from my experience. Ultimately, I think this strikes at the heart of what we're doing when we tell stories or narrativizing anything. Making sense of our place in the universe, telling ourselves a story, is a process of reducing complexity and focusing on details that we've decided are important. In prestige video game development, as Cameron Kuntzman dubs it, there's a temptation to make video games increasingly cinematic. In doing so, developers are forsaking the obvious strengths of narrative, interactive media. But what do you think? Is Mario Kart a better story than The Last of Us? Let me know in the comments below, or in the Padlet attached in the description. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you enjoy the next one.